According to scholar Eric Hobsbawm, the French and Industrial Revolution serves as history's two most influential and pivotal revolutions in the sense that all that we know of the world today can be traced back to either of these events. Now, this idea ultimately rests on the notion that there were changes made in both of these revolutions that set the course of history into the direction of where we are today. These changes included the altering of institutions and power, or the sudden proliferations in technology, nationalism, and the like. Now, this in turn changed the culture, and more specifically, it changed it into the culture of liberal democracies. What is important to note, however, is that just because something is, doesn't mean that it was meant to be, nor will it be desired by all. That is to say, not all who live in liberal democracies approve of it. If they did, a revolution would never be met with opposition in the first place. In this video, I would like to focus on one particular example of this opposition. This is someone who led a revolution that, though political in nature, was ultimately more artistic. In being someone that did not approve of liberal democracies, he revolted against it by looking to the traditions that had existed prior. He advocated for a monarchical, aristocratic, and anti-capitalist ideal. Essentially, he stood in opposition to the culture so associated by the French and Industrial Revolution. I am, of course, talking about Yukio Mishima, and this video will examine the unconventional nature of his revolution, and it will focus on just how he rebelled against the liberal democratic culture that had taken over Japan. But before any of this, we must quickly introduce the man himself. If you ever decide to watch a video on the celebrated yet controversial author, if you ever read any book or article, then 9 times out of 10, you will notice that it will begin the story with one day in particular: his death. Those familiar with Mishima have most certainly heard the event and the context. Upon attempting to, and subsequently failing to, rally the self-defense forces to restore the powers of the emperor, he committed harakiri, which was, as you probably have heard, is a ritual suicide practiced in feudal Japan. The reason why I bring this up is that it will become clear that his death was the final attempt in his long series of artistic endeavors carried out for the purpose of resurrecting a culture dead for generations in post-war liberal democratic Japan. Yukio Mishima was therefore almost like an ambassador of a culture overtaken. His way of life was now anachronistic because in Japan's case, much like Weimar Germany, the liberal democratic culture that took over the previous one was not only foreign, but specifically constructed to overwrite said previous culture for the political agendas of these foreign nations. Now, this is in no way a unique case. In fact, ironically, countries including Japan have engaged in the rewriting of the cultures of other nations for their own purposes. And this is so common that there is actually a word for it: assimilation. And how did Japan assimilate to a liberal democracy? Well, much of what happened could be understood by knowing a single pattern. The foreign powers have reconstructed Japan in substance and preserved it in its outer appearance. This is to say, how the country presented itself remained while the way it functioned changed. In Japan, there was no regime change. The emperor was still the head of state, and he has appeared to keep his place. The substance beneath it, however, was negated. His divinity was taken out, the substantial essence was gone, while the outer appearance remained. Now, this isn't to say that there wasn't change in appearance at all. In fact, there was an unprecedented amount of change. Never before in Japanese history was there the level of political freedom and individual liberty that existed in Mishima's time. In the 1960s, for example, this newfound mass politics saw a huge wave of protests and clashes with the state. Along with human and political rights, there were also political instability and division. Left-wing movements now gathered uncensored by the state police would congregate mainly in the universities. These student movements would commit arson, take people hostage as political prisoners, and, most eventful of such examples, would be the time communist students as young as 17 years old hijacked a plane in order to land in North Korea to start a worldwide communist revolution. Now, on the right-wing end of the spectrum, Apart from Mishima literally trying to restore the Japanese Empire, political assassinations on the leader of Japan's Socialist Party was caught on live air. So what I'm saying is that there were changes for sure, and big changes. But despite all this, despite Japan being altered and divided politically and culturally, at the very least, on the most superficial level, things were the same. This is to say, as things got way too out of hand, the Americans would be sure to step in to make sure that Japan didn't sway off the course too drastically. As a comparison, whereas the Weimar Republic had its substance and appearance negated, Japan only had its substance negated. The Kaiser was dethroned. The same could not be said for Japan. A republic was established in Weimar. The same again could not be said for Japan. Therefore, an outer shell of Japan, with its emperor and much of the politicians running it, retained their positions, which is the realm of appearance, but not so much their power, which is the realm of substance. Therefore, the car remained to be a car. It kept its color, and one way or another, it kept on moving, but its engine was replaced. And this is where Mishima comes in. His death, which in and of itself was a relic of the past in terms of how it was done, was a part of a grander set of motivations that he had applied to bring back a culture in a local context brought from a foreign origin point. The local context, of course, was Japan, and the foreign culture was, of course, the liberal democracy that Mishima had opposed. Therefore, the significance of his death was that he was essentially asserting a way of life that had been killed. It was the death of the flesh with the intent to resurrect the dead substance of a nation, alive only in its appearance for 25 years. And his death was just the grand finale, the final spectacle that followed a long series of actions that had one common denominator: ascetics. Essentially, his death was an expression of this ascetic ideal, of a Japan that was Japanese in not just appearance, but substance. The word for this is kokutai, which is the national essence of Japan. And it was for this that he picked up the pen for his novels. It was this that he picked up the roles for his movies, and above all, for the life that he lived and ultimately killed. Now, except there was one problem. While everything above explains what he did, which was bringing back the substance of Japan onto this new local context, the problem was the way he revolted through art, which contradicts the very substance of Japan. If that sounds confusing, let me show you some photos of Japan before the war. And now let me show you some photos of Mishima's home. And finally, let me show you who he was influenced by. Granted, he was influenced by Japanese people as well, no doubt about that, but the number of people from abroad that he was inspired by is telling. And these aren't just any people. These are the people considered to be the founders and shakers of Western civilization. If you haven't gotten my point, I am essentially saying that there is a paradox. How can one establish the traditions of a nation if your philosophy is inspired by the traditions of other nations? What this means is that wherever he took his inspiration from, be it from foreign or domestic, he had to make it fit his present political agenda. And this opens up the next part of the video. We have covered what he did, now it is time to figure out how he did it. In the article Regimes and Repertoires by Charles Tilly, the way revolutions come to fruition is examined. The main idea is that the nature of the status quo determines the nature of the revolution, depending on how it comes into conflict with the values of the revolutionary. So, to contextualize it, Mishima's revolution was a reaction to the liberal democratic context that he was against because it contradicted his values. And how one revolts is derived from the possible means at one's disposal. The term repertoires of contention is used in the article to describe the means by which you revolt. Now, given that conventional revolutions revolve along more political lines, such as taking institutional power and enacting out a program in civic life, this is what Tilly most likely had in mind when he thought about the so-called repertoires of contention. With this in mind, one can see that because Mishima did not deal primarily with states and government as most revolutionaries do, his revolution and the repertoires of contention that he had would be different from most. This is crucial because by virtue of being an unconventional revolutionary, it goes against what the academic literature thinks of revolution. Political scientist Samuel Huntington, for example, defines revolution as a rapid, fundamental, and violent domestic change in the dominant values and myths of society, in its political institutions, social structure, leadership, and government activity and policies. Therefore, according to him, changes in the government where the social and political structures remain as they were do not qualify as a revolution according to this definition. This sheds light on how Mishima's crusades goes completely outside the framework of conventional understanding of revolutionary activities. It doesn't merely counter the common notion of revolution, it operates in another dimension altogether, beyond the dimensions of mere institutions and controlling the state. In fact, for Mishima, it was a cultural revolution, to rejuvenate the spirit of Japan and the Japanese people. One ought to understand that Mishima used unconventional means to revolt. His revolution was cultural, therefore his method of revolt, which is to say repertoires of contention, was more ascetic. And it shouldn't be a surprise that Mishima chose to stay away from direct political confrontation. After all, why would he? He had no reason to, given that, as talked about already, the substance of Japan, the essence of it all, was what altered, not the appearance. On the outside, the institutions were kept the same. Much of the political bureaucracy remained in office. It's just that the substance behind the appearance was altered. By all appearances, the monarchy remained, but that which gave him power, the substance behind the appearance, was gone. In other words, the car remains the same, but its engine is replaced to fit the current conditions of the road. Therefore, changing the appearance of Japan was not what Mishima had set out to do. There was no need to change what institutions were in power. He only had to change how they functioned. So he sought to change that which was behind what met the eye, the spirit of the nation, the power of the emperor, and the substance behind the appearance. Is it any wonder then that for someone so determined to restore the power of the emperor, Mishima himself had criticized Emperor Hirohito for denouncing his own status as a divine figure? Now, going back to the topic of resurrecting the spirit of Japan ironically through cultural values of the West, it must be understood that it is only a contradiction insofar as one thinks that values must be restricted to a certain region. In reality, cultural values are unique insofar as it was created through unique circumstances. But all of the values that Mishima had were not exclusive to Japan, all the while being a key component of Japanese culture. What this means is that a culture now taken over by liberal democracies was also present elsewhere around the world. For example, a key component of his worldview was the useful expression which manifested in strength and violence in a warrior-like fashion, and he found this in many of the ancient Greek cultural values. Therefore, he was able to cherry-pick certain values that were considered Western to combat other Western values that he did not approve of. From this, one can see that cultures can originate in a given location, but they are not restricted to the place of origin. Through this perspective, one can see that values like aristocracy was a global value that was accentuated in various regions like ancient Greece or Rome. By the same logic, values like liberal democracies can exist all across the world, and the origin point of liberal democracies in each country can differ due to its ubiquitous nature. For example, whereas Hobsbawm anchored it around the French Revolution, for post-war Japan, liberal democracy came from America, not France. This is ultimately what strains Hobbes' idea. If the liberal democracies we see today came from France, what would explain the role other nations played in spreading it? This doesn't negate the role France played. Rather, it merely points out that rather than thinking of liberal democracy as spreading on a straight line from France to Japan, it is better to think of the spread of culture as a grid that can extend its influence in all directions, with each layer being more influenced by the preceding layer than the layer that originated the culture to begin with. Mishima applied this to incorporate cultural values so as to use the West to combat the West to revive the Japanese spirit. Therefore, he clashed his traditional set of Western values against a new set which he saw as corrupting Japan. This observation answers why his biggest influences were, aside from Japanese literature and cultural figures, people like Wilde, Nietzsche, and the ancient Greek philosophers who are regarded by many to be the foundations of Western civilization. So we know that Mishima's personal values were corroborated by both Japan and the West, while contradicted by more modern Western values of capitalism. And we know that these values were presented through artistic endeavors to revolt against modern Japan. If Mishima is popular today, if his works are read by millions across the world, then what does that say about the endurance of Mishima's repertoires of contention? What does that say about the power of ascetics? Repertoires of contention are the means by which people mobilize to revolt. And Mishima revolted through art because he saw the coming of American materialism and consumerism. Therefore, he rebelled against modernity with ascetics. For Mishima, November 25th, 1970 was the day in which ascetics became entrenched in the zeitgeist, and therefore it became the means of contention, the means of a spiritual revolution, and his death became an extension of his way of living. For him, life became an art, and through it, he rebelled against the new local context that he found himself in. It was an artistic endeavor in the sense that his death was designed to have a metaphysical meaning beyond itself. This was the moment in which he turned his life into a line of poetry written with a splash of blood. In the localized context of an ever-materialistic consumer society, every act of beauty became a revolt against the modern world.